audible? Okay, thank you. Thank you for your response, everyone. So let's start with the session now. So today, basically, let me try to introduce what all content we are trying to cover in this webinar. So basically, we are basically trying to get started with web development, right? So even before we actually get started with web development, we would first of all need to get an idea about how websites work, and all the prerequisite knowledge that we require in order to get started with web development. So this information is necessary also for your interviews, and as a web developer you should obviously have an idea of how the websites basically work. So we'll get started with that. Okay, so I'll share my screen. Okay, so basically all the websites that we are using, these websites are actually there on the internet, right? All of these websites are actually available on the internet. So we should first of all understand what is meant by internet. So all of us would be familiar with what that basically means. So can someone type in the chat box, what do you guys understand by the term internet? Okay, I'm getting some response. Interconnected network connecting people. It's a browsing tool. Correct. It's a platform where we can clear our doubts, helps in communication. So all of these responses that we are getting are absolutely correct. So internet can be thought of, like, it can be defined in many different ways, but uh, so there can be many different ways using which we can actually define internet. One of those ways is to basically think of internet as a long piece of wire which connects different computers together. Now, connecting different computers together makes sense, but what is this long piece of wire? So let me take you to this site. So you can see that a very huge giant wire is basically connecting all of these machines or computers together, and it is running throughout the world. It is running throughout the globe. So this is the huge giant wire that we are talking about. So what is this giant wire called? It's called the backbone of the internet. It is called the backbone of the internet. So what it does is it basically runs throughout the world and connects all the machines and computers together and enables us to make the communication possible. Okay, so that is what is meant by the backbone of the internet. Okay, so this was the first line. Now these computers can talk to each other and transfer the data through this giant wire. So what is internet? Internet is basically this long giant piece of wire which is connecting, which is basically making communication possible and enabling us to transfer the data throughout the world. Okay, so that is what is meant by internet. Okay, is my voice audible? Can someone acknowledge? Is my voice
Yeah,
clear?
Pragna, it's audible.
Okay, fine. Thank you. Okay, moving on to the next topic, which is server. So now we've talked about this huge network, right, which runs across the globe, right? This huge network that runs across the globe. So now this network does not just contain the PCs and the laptops that we are using. Okay, it also contains some extremely powerful machines. It also contains some extremely powerful machines or computers, which is called server. So what do we understand by server? Server is basically uh, a very powerful machine that is also present within this network. Let us try to understand this machine in detail. Okay, so first of all, let's go through this definition. So some of these computers attached to internet have a special job. They have to be online 24 by 7 to serve you all the data and files that you are requesting when you try to access the website. So now let's try to understand what this basically means. So now let's say you type in corizo.in. Okay, so let's say you type in corizo.in, and so what happens, within a few seconds you are able to, within a fraction of second basically, you are able to see this website, right? So what is basically happening? So as soon as I typed in corizo.in, this is the request that my PC or my computer is sending. Where is this request getting sent to? This particular request is sent to the server. So let's say I type in google.com. Okay, I type in google.com, so the request is basically sent to Google's server. So what do we understand by the term server? So server is basically a very powerful machine or a computer that is capable of handling the requests. Okay, we will be getting back to server once we like in a few more minutes. Okay, for now let us just try to understand that server is a very powerful computer that is capable of handling requests. Okay, and what is this request? Like me, if I am typing in google.com, and someone else, let's say XYZ, is also typing in google.com, some third person is also typing in google.com, so all of these requests is redirected to a machine which is called server, and server is the one who fetches the request. Okay, server is the one which fetches the request, uh, basically fetches the data that we are trying to request and sends it back. Okay, um, so that is what is meant by server. Now you might have this misconception, like right now we are talking about server basically handling the request and fetching the data and responding back to us. We might also have learned that server is something that stores the data. That is also true. So server has a very huge storage capacity. So the storage capacity of server is thousands of terabyte. Okay, but that is not the only responsibility of a server. Server's job is also to handle the request. And why did I say that server is extremely powerful machine? Because it is capable of handling hundreds of requests, and it has a storage capacity of thousands of terabyte. So basically, what you did is you simply added the URL to the browser and you expect to see the website on the screen. So the website is basically stored on the server, or the code that is written for that website is stored on the server. And we are basically requesting for that particular code so that we can view that web page. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Please type in yes in the chat box if you are able to understand what is meant by server. Okay, thank you for responding, everyone. All right, so moving on. So the next part is client. Now we have talked about what is meant by server. Let's try to understand what is client. One second. So let's try to understand what is basically meant by client. So client, the so let's say my computer is making request to Google's server. Okay, so my computer will be called client. So the computer or the machine which makes the request, right? So the machine that makes the request is called client. So the definition you can see here, the computer that any user uses to access the internet are called clients. Okay. So moving on. Now the website, let's try to, right now we are trying to understand the request response cycle. So let me try to explain first of all, what is meant by request response cycle. Okay, so basically what we are here trying to do is, the website is basically stored, we have just seen that the website is basically stored on the server, or the code that is written for that website is stored on the server. Okay, and when we type in google.com or we type in corizo.in, we are basically trying to access the web page from that server. Okay, so the entire process that happens behind the scene in order to access the web page, like from the time I typed in google.com and till I am getting back the response. So what all steps are basically happening? What all things are basically happening for me to get this particular response? So that is basically the request response cycle, and we'll try to quickly understand what steps are basically included. Okay, so the first step is the client sends the message to the ISP. Now, what is the ISP? So ISP basically stands for Internet Service Provider. Okay, so Internet Service Provider is basically an organization that provides services for accessing the internet. For example, Geo, AT&T, right? So these are the organizations that helps us access the internet. Okay, so what's happening here? Who is the client? Client as in I typed in google.com. Okay, I typed in google.com. That is my client. That is the client. That is my PC is requesting for google.com. So first step, what happened? That this request is sent to the ISP. That is the Internet Service Provider. What is the next step? The next step is that ISP relays the message to the DNS server. Okay, ISP relays the message to the DNS server. Now, what is DNS server? Let's try to understand this in detail. Now, for this, let's take one example. Okay, so let's say I tell you that my name is Prerna Gupta. So you would basically remember that. Okay, you will remember that in, let's say, today, or let's say in 1 or 2 days, you will remember that. But let's say if I tell you that my contact number is some 9898506712, something, some 10-digit number, okay? Some 10-digit number. So you would not be able to remember that. Why? Because human brains are wired in such a way that we are good with words and not numbers, right? So we can remember words, we cannot remember numbers that easily. On the other hand, the machines are wired in such a way that they find it easier to deal with numbers, right? But they are not good with human languages, like, words, the English words that we are speaking. So what do we have here is, now this google.com that you actually have here is is made for, these URLs are basically made for the human beings to remember. Okay. So the official address of each server is an IP address. And how does an IP address looks like? An IP address looks like this number. So this number, like if so obviously it is easier for us to remember google.com and not this huge number, isn't it? So that is why we have this URLs. So now the question is, if the address, if the actual official address of the server is this IP address and we are typing in google.com, then how is our request sent, is how is our request actually received and received or accessed by the server? So the answer to this question is the DNS server. So the DNS server's responsibility is to map these URLs with its corresponding IP address. Okay. So what happens is, the responsibility of the DNS server is to map the URLs with its corresponding IP address. So for example, you just because you cannot remember all the contact numbers of your friends and relatives, so that is why in your phone you have phone book, right? What is the task of, or what is the responsibility of this phone book? It basically maps each of your contact number with the name, right? So that is basically similar to what DNS does. It has the entire record of which URL corresponds to which IP address. Okay, so the responsibility of your DNS server is to map the URL with its corresponding IP address. So now that you understand what is meant by DNS server, let's get back to these steps. Okay, so the IP address, so the ISP relays the message to the DNS server. Okay, now the DNS server maps the URL to the IP address. So now what happened? Now finally you actually have the correct IP address, that is the official address of the server. So with the able with if you have the IP address with the help of your official address of the server, now your um, your PC or the client is now finally able to make the direct request through the backbone to the server. So now finally you are able to make the request to the server through the backbone. And finally, the server sends back all the files through the backbone. So this is what happens behind the scene when you request for any web page. Please type in yes in the chat box if that makes sense. All right. Okay. Okay, thank you for your response, everyone. Thank you. Moving on. So now we have seen that the server is sending back the response. All right. Now what's happening here is we are finally able to get the response. But what is that response? The response could be like many other things also. Like let's say the response could be a CSS file, or it could be a JSON, or it could, but in most of the situations, the response is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So now let's try to understand what is meant by HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So basically, if you want to become a web developer, you would need to start with learning these three languages. Now, these three languages are the three languages for front end. Okay, now these are the languages for front end. Okay, so what do we understand by the front end? We'll talk about it shortly. Okay, so basically I'm trying to explain that these three languages combine together to form the front end of the website. Okay, so now let's try to understand what is meant by the front end. Okay, so basically, you, for a website, you have front end and back end. Okay, so front end is basically front end of a website is what you can see and what you can interact. So basically, we'll try to understand this with the help of an example. So let's say you went to a restaurant. Okay, and this restaurant have a different way of taking your order. So let's say this particular restaurant makes the use of a website. So what happens here is, with the help of this website, you can, let's say you want to order sandwich. So you typed in sandwich in let's say this text box. So this text box that you are looking here is basically what you can see, right? So 1 second. So let's say this is the text box. So this is your restaurant's web page, and you can actually type in, let's say, sandwich, and all the recipes that is basically related to your search will basically be displayed. So now um, in this example, what comprises of the front end? So basically the search button and the search box. So the text box, the input field. So these things that you can see here comprises of your front end. All that you can see on the web page comprises of the front end. Okay, so now what about the backend? So backend basically comprises of the server and the database. So now let's say you typed in sandwich, or let's say Maggie, and then you hit enter. So this was about front end, because you could see and interact. Basically, you could interact the way the part of the website that enables the user to interact is basically called the front end. But talking about the back end, the response that you are getting is again the front end, right? Let's say this is the response that you get. So let's say this is the response that you got. So this is also front end, the heading, the paragraph, and the images. So this is also the front end. So now what is the back end? So this data, when you hit enter, and only then you are able to get this response, right? So where is this data coming from? So the data is actually coming from the database. And the request is handled by the server. So that is backend. So we'll get back to what is front end and what is backend and how is this happening shortly. But I just wanted here to explain what is meant by front end. So front end is basically you are the part of the website that enables you to interact and interact with the web page. So all the headings, images, and everything that you are able to interact is basically the front end of your website. Okay, so now these three languages enable you to create your front end. Let's start with HTML. So let's try to understand HTML with an analogy of your home. So let's say your home is your website, then your bricks and the cements are your HTML. So basically you can think of HTML as a skeleton of your web page. So all the components that basically make your website is basically the HTML. You can place all these elements. Which elements? The logo, the heading, the paragraph, the button, the image. So all these elements, the search, the button, the search box. So all these elements, you are able to place these elements by making use of HTML. So HTML is basically the structure or the skeleton. HTML defines the structure of your website. It is the skeleton of your website. Okay. So now talking about CSS. What is the role of CSS? So again, getting back to the home example. So if the HTML is the bricks and cements of your web page, then the CSS would be the tiles and the paint and the entire decoration of your home. Is basically if your home is a website, then the tiles and the entire decoration part is basically defined by the CSS. Now let's take a look at this website. So HTML defined that we'll have this learn boldly and inspire, get an education, not just a degree. So this is the content that I want to place. That is defined by it. Okay. But what is defined, but who defines that this has to be this large or black in color? CSS is the one who defines that. Who defines that the color of this particular button should be purple, and when I bring my cursor towards it, the font color should change to white? CSS defines it. So what is the role of CSS? CSS basically defines the design of your website. Okay, coming back to JavaScript. So now what is the role of JavaScript? So basically, if you're again the home example, so your bricks and cement is your HTML, the paint and tiles and decoration is your CSS, and the way the electricity and the water supply and the way this home is functioning is defined by JavaScript. So JavaScript basically defines how things will basically work. By making use of HTML and CSS alone, you would obviously have access to the content. You will be able to view the content, and you will be able to basically see the content and the images, and you will be able to design it, right? But if I click on this no more, right, if I click on this no more, then it should take me to this particular form, and if I type in my details and I click on submit button and I hit enter, so then what should happen? All these things are basically defined by JavaScript. So JavaScript adds functionality to your website. So that is what is meant by that is what is meant by JavaScript. Okay, so these three languages, I hope that makes sense. Here we have also made use of one example. So let's say I want to place a paragraph. So I'll do that by making use of HTML. Now let's say I want to add color to it. Okay, so I want to make this paragraph red. So I'll I'll do that by making use of CSS. Now let's say I want to do something like, if something happens, I want to hide that paragraph, so that I can make it happen by making use of JavaScript. Okay, so that was about the front end languages. Now let's try to understand what is meant by the front end and back end. So now let's try to understand the back end in detail. So basically, as I explained earlier, your backend comprises of your database and the server. So now, if your website has the database, right? So the data you are so the getting back to the restaurant example. So if your if your data is actually stored in the database, then why do we even need server? So let's say you typed in sandwich and you hit the search button, and you're getting all the response related to your search, right? So where is that data coming from? So that data is basically stored in the database. But how is server involved here? So basically, the problem over here is that your database is only capable enough of storing the data. It is not capable of handling the requests. So what happens here is the server basically server is kind of middleman. It connects the front end with the database. What it does is it so the request that is sent from the client or the front end. So the front end basically sends the request to the server, and server's job is to sit and listen for the requests. As soon as it receive the request, okay, that now the user is asking for all the recipes related to sandwich. So immediately it will fetch the data from the database and it will send it back to the front end. So the server's responsibility is to listen to the requests and provide the front end with the response. Okay, so that was about introduction and how the website works. I hope that makes sense, and you can all type in yes in the chat box if everything makes sense and if you have any questions. That's it from my end. Thank you, everyone. Okay, thank you so much for your response.